said he was out of town.
Before we start, are we getting anybody in this seat pretty soon?
Recording in progress.
Working on that.
Good.
Uh, 7 o'clock, you ready? You have 7 on yours? Holy moly. Good? Good evening. Call to order the Plan Commission meeting, City of Franklin, Thursday, August 3rd, 2023, 7 p.m. Mary, would you please take the roll?
Mayor Nelson,
Here.
Commissioner Hogan,
Here.
Commissioner Haley,
Here.
City Engineer Morrow,
Here.
Alderman Day.
Here.
We are also joined by the Planning Manager Lori Miller, myself, Associate Planner X, and the Director of Administration Kelly Hirsch.
Sounds good. And one is absent would be
Patrick Leon.
Mr. Patrick Leon. Okay, please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Go on to item B, approval of the minutes, approval of the regular meeting minutes of July 20th, 2023.
Move approval.
Second.
We have a first and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it, motion carries. Moving on to C. Public hearing, do you want to take this from here, Marion?
There are no public hearing items today, so we can move on to regular business.
Excellent. No other comments on that? Going on to D, business matters, the UDO rewrite task force, Cheshire project consultant, natural resource standards. Absolutely. Anybody want to make a motion to suspend the rules?
I would move to suspend the rules.
Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Is this mic on? Oh, no, it is. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Hold on, we've got a first and a second.
Oh, sorry.
All
I should know that by now.
those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it, rules are suspended.
Thank you.
Again, please state your name,
Sure.
address for said record.
Yes, Dana Gint, 9011 West Hawthorne Lane. I'm here tonight because I have spoke at probably 4 or 5 planning commission meetings regarding the UDO rewrite, specifically regarding environmental impacts, specifically noise and pollutants. And the response I keep getting is that the noise will be addressed at a future meeting. So I'm asking exactly what date that will be, and if someone can notify me what date the noise ordinance is going to be reviewed. And I just want to bring up that it's kind of confusing. Like tonight, you're talking about Chapter 7. The ordinances don't have any chapters that I can tell. They're called, like Part 7 has several different sections, but none of them are called parts. So that's kind of confusing to me. Part 7 in the UDO is required plans. Site plans, natural resource protection is one of the subparts of that. And I believe you guys already went through Part 3, which I believe you labeled as Chapter 3. And that was PDD, special uses standards, and the item on there of hazard abatement performance standards includes noises. So I'm wondering how you guys are deciding what is included under chapter reviews. It doesn't seem like you're going through all sections. It's just, and it seems very random. So I'm trying to understand why it's not going in order from what I can tell, or just to have better public input. And I know myself and other citizens have asked that there actually be public input regarding this UDO rewrite, because there hasn't been. Obviously, I have to ask for suspension of the rules, which I don't classify as real public input. There has been no public meeting. For the comprehensive master plan, you had 19 neighborhood meetings. And several citizens and myself have asked that this be posted in the newsletter, some sort of public meeting that people can come and talk about the UDO, because obviously this impacts the entire city. And obviously natural resources protection, I read through the packet as much as I could, and wildlife is mentioned, but it's only mentioned under shoreline wetland zoning restrictions. Obviously there's wildlife all around this area. And it's not really addressed in this natural resource protection, which I think is something that should be. And specifically, there are 6 parks within 2 miles of the Rock Sports Complex that need to be protected. The adverse impact on humans also relates to wildlife, that it inhibits. And I have 2 letters that I'd like to submit for the record. One's from the Milwaukee River Advocates in 2018, giving an environmental perspective on the Ballpark Commons project. Again, this is from 2018. And they put in there noisy bright activities happening in an area adjacent to wildlife habitat is extremely detrimental. Noise becoming more recognized for what it is in excess pollution. Noise disrupts the breeding, behavior, and hormones of wildlife and inevitably impacts wetland habitat and wildlife that lives there. There's another letter from Milwaukee River Advocates that says it damages wildlife breeding patterns, drives away people and important species, and hunting and survival instincts of animals are altered, and it severely degrades the experience of all county residents wishing to quietly enjoy the natural beauty of this area. And that's regarding the loud noise from the Rock Sports Complex. So I'd like these to be on the record, to be included in the UDO packet for future discussion. And then I did some research on pollutants regarding to fireworks, and obviously the fireworks are very impactful, not only by noise, but also pollutants. So there's a posting from the fireworks. The Bombers fireworks are canceled, and it's the Battle Creek Bombers, a Northwoods minor league baseball team, have been canceled indefinitely after perchlorate which are used in fireworks, have been found in the groundwater surrounding this area. It just goes on and on, that there's health impacts that need to be examined regarding fireworks. And there's 9 fireworks this year. There's been a total of 30. So it's not once a year kind of civil celebrations event. It is it's not a civic celebration. It is a entertainment thing, and it's just excessive. So I appreciate if you guys look into that, and please address the noise issue in the ordinance. Thank you.
One of the things that I'd like to, and I'll let the rest of the group, if they wish to comment on this with you, is I definitely want to see community feedback and involvement with the UDO, Ms. Gint, no question. So, and that's one of the things that I had an issue with a year ago when that wasn't happening. So now, obviously the tides have changed, things are turning, and we will have citizen feedback and input on certain parts, but I think I like to do it a little systematic. So when there's a certain task or a certain area that wants to be discussed upon, I just want to have it in an organized fashion so feedback can be logged and feedback can be, captured in an organized way.
I appreciate that. It's obviously a giant task. So
Huge.
I don't want there to be one public meeting and you go, here's 1,000 pages to review, because that's overwhelming for everyone involved.
Well,
and obviously there's certain sections that, they're interrelated, like natural resource protection also relates to site plans. So there's a lot of overlap, and a lot of these, and the design standards, which I spoke on, which was chapter 5, according to their, classification, that the design standards don't even include outdoor acoustic systems, which is just insane to me that there's 60 pages related to signs and fencing and architectural detail, but there's zero information that is impactful for 2 miles surrounding this development. The Milwaukee County, I don't know if you guys have read the Milwaukee County Sound Report, but it clearly states that on page 238, it says the noise and disturbances from this facility is clearly audible 2 miles away. Clearly audible is not talking about the fireworks. That's much more than 2 miles, obviously. It's clearly audible, so that means the Milkman games, the songs and the lyrics can be heard 2 miles away. And I only live a half mile away. And I know Mayor Nelson, before he was, when he was alderman, spoke in front of a neighborhood gathering and said he could hear it on the golf course. So, and that's a mile away. So obviously something needs to be done, and I appreciate your assistance with that. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, is there a motion to go back to regular?
I move that we return to the normal order of business.
Second?
We have a first and a second. Hearing nothing further in conversation. All those saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it. Motion carries. Back to regular business. So we, right now, with this part, are we, watch out for that, Kevin. going to discuss, I mean, if Ms. Wiesner wants to come up to the front here, I mean, are we going to be interacting with the group, the remote group?
Yes, so I am going to do a bit of a preamble to their presentation to provide some context on the existing Unified Development Ordinance Natural Resource Protection Standards. Some of you are new and have not had to review these before, and also just for the record, and so folks have an understanding of what the current ordinance contains. Then JB and Ruben from Halcyon Levine and Birchline Planning will pitch in with their suggestions for a revised chapter. So I am going to have to supersede JB. I'm going to hide her with my presentation. Sorry, JB. But you can hear us now, right? Okay, good. Okay, so, and please feel free to interject with questions, but bear in mind that some of your questions may also be answered by the discussion as well. So if I'm like, I'll get to that, it's not that I'm not taking the question seriously, it's that I will literally get to it. So, okay, and with that, so the Unified Development Ordinance, the current ordinance is Part 4, Natural Resource Protection Standards, is the majority of the natural resource protection standards within the ordinance. They are, however, and JB is going to get into this in greater depth, scattered throughout the ordinance itself. So while the definitions of what natural resources are protected under the ordinance lie within this particular section, the protection standards and how they are evaluated and also what is required for mitigation, et cetera, is literally just scattered throughout the UDO. And so that is one of the many reasons that this project was undertaken, is because it is difficult to interpret, it is difficult to share information with the general public and with developers, et cetera. So I am this typical reviewer of natural resource protection plans when they exceed the standards of the UDO currently. And what that means is that I take a look and say, here are the categories of resources and here's what you're exceeding. So just in general, though, this is Franklin's ordinance. So I want to be very clear that we have our own set of natural resource protection standards, and it does not supersede federal and state law. So we're not able to issue a permit for a natural resource impact that has not also been authorized by those other bodies. So just bear that in mind, that this is Franklin's ordinance, and there may be questions about things like floodplain and wetlands and how they relate to those other bodies, and we'll talk about that. But I just want to be very clear that we're talking about Franklin's own ordinance. So many of you have reviewed what's called a natural resource special exception. That is a type of variance. So the standards for that are actually under the variance standards within the ordinance and not in Part 4. So just to clarify that lies in a different chapter, and then we can talk about how that is reviewed and what the process is. But I want to start with kind of the core document that the Plan Commission looks at and planners look at when reviewing natural resources in the city of Franklin. So our ordinances require what is called a Natural Resource Protection Plan, or an NRPP. So stop me if the acronyms are annoying, but a Natural Resource Protection Plan. Ha.
I was waiting for somebody to say something.
Yeah, so a natural resource protection plan is a required document for all land divisions. So that means any certified survey map splitting a parcel into between 2 and 4 lots, and for all subdivision plats, so any number of lots exceeding 4, and also for all site plans. So this commission sees them in that context of land divisions and site plans, and then Common Council also reviews them as part of the land division process. There are a number of requirements that flow out of the Natural Resource Protection Plan. We require conservation easements. In certain contexts, we require setbacks and buffers, and all of that information is contained within that document. But it is kind of the core of what the Natural Resource Protection Standards, how they're presented to this body. So it's regulated by the UDO. There are required elements. It has to have certain basic pieces of information so that we can interpret it clearly. Some of how that information is shown. There's great variation in the types of NRPPs that we see. And part of what the updated ordinance is going to do is clarify and simplify how that information is presented and standardize it, because it is not currently standardized. A natural resource protection plan is not something that you can produce yourself. We require field examination by a qualified professional. What that typically means, because the most common impact in Franklin is to wetlands, is that a wetland delineation is performed. You may have heard the phrase an assured delineator. What that means is that a person performing the delineation has met the standards of the Department of Natural Resources to perform this and has a reliable delineation standard. So that person is experienced, consistent, ethical, and the DNR maintains a list of people who are assured that do not then need to receive a certification of the delineation that they performed from the DNR under a separate review. The certification is automatic because that person is assured. It is also possible to get a wetland delineation from someone that lacks that assured status, but then the DNR has to go through a greater level of review and will then submit a certification on the wetland delineation. So that's an important requirement. I know we often hear wetland delineations are something that can delay the development process because there's seasonal requirements, et cetera, but that's an important piece of this. And then the document itself is both a written report that has qualitative and quantitative information in it, including often the delineation report, and a map of the resources. So what we tend to focus on is the map, and I'm going to show you an example. You can see both how much information is contained here and how potentially confusing it can be. So this is an example of, it's a detail from a natural resource special exception from 2019, and this drawing has all of the types of protected natural resources in it. So it's a little bit difficult to interpret because of the layering of that information. But this is actually the NRSE for the Conservancy for Healing and Heritage. So in this drawing, we have a water body with its setback. We have wetlands with their setback and buffer. We have steep slopes, and there's also woodlands, although it's a little poorly defined here. This area is all woodland area. So this is an example of the drawing. It's a required element for those types of applications we discussed earlier. And this is what becomes the document of record for interpreting what information the applicant has provided so that we can make sure that they're not exceeding the standards of the ordinance, or if they are, where they're doing that and to what extent. So does anyone have any questions about what you're seeing here? I mean, so this is Kottmeyer Lake, and the Conservancy is actually over here off the screen, but the goal with some of this process will be to break this up into more digestible chunks, if that makes sense. But this is an example of kind of everything in one drawing. So we talked a little bit about what features are protected. So I touched on water bodies. These are all of the types of natural resources that are protected under the current UDO. So that consists of steep slopes at different percentages of grade, mature woodlands, which are a stand of trees of 8 trees or greater that exceeds 8 inches of the diameter at breast height. So this is something that it's measured based on the size of the tree. And it's any kind of tree. So that is something that the revision will be discussing to some extent, because there are, for example, we have stands of buckthorn that are protected by these standards. A young woodland would be the same size, but size of area, but a smaller diameter of tree. And then all water bodies have protection. So with woodlands and forests, you can impact a percentage of them. It's 50% of young woodland or 30% of mature woodland without special approval. But for all types of water bodies, we require that natural resource special exception process in addition to whatever permitting might be required from federal and state government. So we have listed here lakes and ponds, streams, the shore buffer, which is 75 feet from the ordinary high water mark of a water body, which is a river or a pond, et cetera. Floodplain and floodway. There is the separate floodplain ordinance, which we'll be looking at and adopting the model ordinance that the state recommends. So that is a separate ordinance, but it overlaps and is layered with these natural resource protection standards. Wetlands and shoreline wetlands, and then wetland buffer. Not included in this list is wetlands setback, which if you permanently impact that and are unable to restore it, that also requires a natural resource special exception. And that touches on another requirement of the UDO, which is that if you are impacting these resources here in Franklin, you must mitigate or restore them here in Franklin. And so the revised ordinance will address that question, but you can see here the mitigation standards and how they work out. So let's see what's coming next. So we talked a little bit about the natural resource special exception process. It's required to impact a natural resource to a greater degree than permitted by the table we just looked at. And the ordinance is here, but it requires review by the Environmental Commission and a recommendation to Plan Commission, review by the Plan Commission, and a recommendation to Common Council. And the Plan Commission has some specific powers under the current ordinance to make allowances for, during that exception process. So mitigation is something that the ordinance requires that it be performed on site. That can be prohibitive in some cases for developers. So if you have a 1 acre site, half of it is wetland, and you want to impact it, and you need to provide 1.5 the amount of mitigation on the same site, you're effectively not able to use the site. But Plan Commission can then allow for off-site mitigation. Plan Commission can also require sureties for mitigation in the form of financial sureties, usually through the landscape plan, saying that when you provide the type of mitigation, it's most typically, again, wetland mitigation, but also trees. They have specified dollar amounts so that if the mitigation is not performed, then the city would theoretically get a dollar amount, and then that would be the resolution of that. So, but ultimately, a natural resource special exception can only be approved by Common Council. And so this also is a core piece of this, is that it goes through this 3-step process, which is lengthy, and has several separate recommendations that evolve over time. And then the Common Council is the final determiner of whether or not the exception will be granted. And they have been denied in the past. There has to be a substantive reason to do so. And it's also worth knowing that the applicant has the burden of proof to show that they have met the requirements to receive that exception. So for example, we receive incomplete applications that do not have a mitigation plan attached to them. This is something that applicants kind of have difficulty conceiving of how that will proceed through the development process, for example. And they also often don't have appropriate delineations done, et cetera. So that kind of information is something that the applicant has to produce for themselves. The city will not produce it for them. And it is costly, but it is also very important that it be conducted accurately, not only because we wish to protect our own ordinances, but we have responsibilities to the other federal and state agencies that regulate these things. So, and I think I have a slide about that. No, I do not. So, and with that, JB is going to talk about what is proposed for the new Part 7. Again, this is a consolidation. So these standards are mostly contained within Part 4, but as I noted it during the presentation, are spread out throughout. So I think that's the first place she wants to start. And then JB, it's your rodeo. So do you need me to unmute you?
No, I'm unmuted.
Okay.
I did want to see if it works for, I can share screen, or you can, whichever on the presentation.
Why don't you share screen? I am not sure what is
All
popping
right.
up in front of me, though.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Do you see a presentation?
Yep.
Okay, glorious. So good evening, Mayor Nelson and members of the commission, thank you for the opportunity to work with the city. I've had the good fortune to work with Franklin in different capacities for a long time. And I'm delighted to support my colleague Ruben and Jackie at Halcyon Levine and Marion and the team in planning on this. So we are acting as planning consultants who do way too much zoning for a living. And what we want to review with you is some suggested changes to the framework for how the city organizes and administers its natural resource standards that Marion just outlined. And I'm going to start with the fact that through, for many, many years in Southeast Wisconsin, Franklin has been known for its natural resource standards. They're recognized as more stringent than those in neighboring communities. They're essential to the high environmental quality that residents really value. We heard that at the kickoff meetings for this UDO update. And they're a bit different. The preparation of the plan and the local requirement for some mitigation in the city is different than some of your peer communities. So when at the outset of this process, which was now 2 years ago, when we did speak with the community and when we interviewed a lot of stakeholders, we found that consistently that those strong standards contribute to the high quality that is of Franklin's community. However, the review and approval process, as Marion outlined, can be very lengthy and it's confusing. In part because the standards are not just contained within Part 4, but in fact are spread across Parts 3, 4, 7, 9, and 10 of the current UDO. And that has led to some confusion of how do I even apply for this? The requirement to mitigate within the city of Franklin for those impacts that can't be avoided has, as Marion has noted, led to some very difficult and some very ill-advised outcomes from a natural resource standpoint. We're going to talk particularly about the fact that it's difficult to remove invasive tree species, including elm and buckthorn, and the issue of requiring on-site mitigation for especially smaller or degraded wetlands, which is deeply challenging in many communities, not in states, not just Franklin. And so we're hoping that the reorganization that we've started to develop with your staff, as well as some prospective standards for trees and in changing a little bit on how the city conserves and adds to its urban canopy, can really enhance this process and make it just more understandable and easier to administer with the same great outcomes. So if I poke the right button here, okay. Key regulations and components. This, as Marion outlined these, I would add one important component to the current suite of natural resource protection that the city enforces through the UDO and through the stormwater ordinance. First, it's that natural resource protection plan that Marion outlined. You have to identify the protected resources, identify any impacts, and then a special exception is required if those impacts are not mitigated. The mitigation plan for those sites where resources can't be mitigated or resources can't be protected, some replacement or mitigation is required. In a few cases, with which Marion is more familiar than me for sure, off-site mitigation has been allowed, but it's very challenging because the process is not well defined. On wetlands, shoreland wetlands, and floodplains, the DNR has very recently updated the state's regulations, especially the floodplain, and its definition of what are called degraded wetlands, which we can talk about in a second. So that has been updated, and that may help with, syncing up to those is likely to help the city do a better job on effective wetland protection and effective wetland mitigation rather than trying to do these on-site small degraded wetlands. And then finally, with the stormwater ordinance, there's definitely an opportunity that we've discussed with Public Works and engineering to sort of make sure that the NRPP protections are consistent with what's required for stormwater and for tree protection. So we have a great opportunity to make sure that those are really synchronized. So in the draft that is under review, and again, this is our draft to staff and then for the city to consider, there's been a very substantial reorganization. And I want to emphasize that the draft that you see is chiefly the bulk of the change is to reorganize so that all of the standards and procedures are together and so that it's much clearer where the authority is to review and approve the NRPPs and to grant those special exceptions, and also to improve mitigation, because that has been challenging. So the new draft of Article 7 incorporates all, oh my goodness, how many sections is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different parts of the existing UDO. So that's the new Article 7. In addition to that, a couple of things are proposed. One is for the city to adopt the new DNR model ordinance for shoreline wetlands, and to have that be a standalone ordinance rather than part of the UDO. It is relatively infrequent that that even comes into play in Franklin, and often those are easier to administer as a standalone ordinance rather than as zoning. The next recommendation, and this is very substantive, so this one bears some discussion. Right now, within those 10 parts of the ordinance, there is some language that tells applicants and the Plan Commission what's required technically to mitigate a natural resource impact. So for example, how many trees of a certain caliper are required for each tree of a certain caliper that is removed? How many square feet of wetland or buffer would be required to be mitigated based on impact, and what kind of planting to do? Because those technical elements of designing effective mitigation are both super site specific and very dependent on the expertise of the consultants who, as Marion noted, the consultants who prepare the plans and who work with the city, we are proposing an option where there would be a guidebook adopted by Plan Commission, but not in the UDO, that sets out the general policies and standards for mitigation to occur. The hope is that by codifying in a guidebook, this is the type of wetland mitigation, these are the ratios of trees, this is when the city forester's input would be taken into account, the city can put its working knowledge and policies in a guidebook that doesn't then require a special exception for every single change in species or caliper that's recommended by professionals at the city and the consultants who are working on these. That has been the source of a lot of grief and delay and complication. And so we're recommending mitigation guidance be incorporated into the UDO by reference, adopted by the Plan Commission as policy, but that gives you a little bit more flexibility for the design of the actual mitigation. It doesn't change the standard, but it lets the design process happen in a more flexible and expert-driven way. Lastly, there's a site intensity calculation worksheet that's currently inside the natural resource that applies to any site plan, so that would be relocated to the front of the UDO. So that's the reorganization. It's not as much about the substance of natural resources as reorganizing the standards and process. So this is kind of a guide to what's in the UDO today and where it would go in this option for reorganization. So right now, again, it's in 10 different sections. This would create one Article 7 that would organize that. I do want to point out, and this is this asterisk. I don't know why I used Michigan colors on this. That's a terrible oversight on my part. But the staff review, what we would recommend codifying, it's your practice today, but it's not codified, is that staff would review proposed mitigation and make a recommendation to the Plan Commission. So that would be just sort of memorializing how that's done. Right now, another important component, currently you require a horizontal setback, fairly substantial, from streams and wetland buffers. We would recommend replacing that horizontal setback with new buffer, very much more specific buffer and fencing requirements, but allowing a little bit more flexibility on the horizontal distance. That is really important for redevelopment, especially in commercial sites where you've got pre-existing parking lots or structures and you can't get 50 feet. Science and practice tell us, and this is from, I have the good fortune to work with DNR in a lot of parts of the state with the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. What our practice tells us is that as an example, 25 feet of really well planted wetland buffer with a fence to keep people from mowing into it is going to do a lot more to protect natural functions, including habitat, than 50 feet of lawn without the fence. So we propose some language in there to allow a little bit of reduction of the buffer horizontally, but require much more active fencing and demarcation of those edges. Again, we're proposing to put together the current practice on mitigation as a guide. The Environmental Commission would be a great place to do some of that review and development. Floodplain requirements, we are proposing that Article 8 in the UDO use the state's very new model ordinance. Rather than trying to mitigate floodplain as a natural resource, that you would simply follow the state guidance. As Marion said, that's going to be layered, and that would just be a cleaner way so that you're not trying to deal with floodplain issues twice. And finally, again, new shoreline wetland ordinance consistent with the DNR's guidance would be recommended. A couple of issues, and these are for your discussion and consideration with your wonderful staff and for policy guidance. One thing on the review process would be, again, that staff would be chiefly charged with reviewing the natural resource protection plans and any mitigation plans and making a recommendation to Plan Commission. A question for you to discuss: should special exceptions for a natural resource should that decision go to Common Council? Today, for some it does, sometimes not, but should those go to Common Council? The second would again be related to floodplain, that the mitigation required not include trying to mitigate floodplain over and above what's required by the state's floodplain ordinance, that we handle floodplain mitigation through the floodplain engineering process rather than also trying to manage that as a resource impact. That has caused some confusion. Third, and probably the most substantive discussion here, the new DNR guidance describes degraded wetlands. It would be our suggestion that you consider not requiring mitigation of a degraded wetland. And we can talk about what the definition of degraded wetland is. It's generally what we'd call anthropogenic wetlands. These are areas that have gotten wet, like the runoff from an old parking lot built before modern stormwater standards, where you get cattails. That right now you would have to mitigate that on site. We would propose taking away that requirement, but then allowing off-site water quality enhancements of a lot of different types that would give people options to enhance Franklin's natural environment and water quality without trying to replace something that nature doesn't necessarily want to be there. And Mary could speak to some cases where that has been a challenge. Again, a couple more recommendations. I think this is my last slide. One, again, is to integrate wetland planting and fencing physical protection of the wetlands instead of just horizontal distance, and then allow a little bit of flexibility on the horizontal distance if you've got a good buffer planted. Another really important one is to allow the removal of invasives without having to prepare a whole and get approval for a whole natural resource protection plan before invasive species are removed. That's a real priority. We've talked about that with your forester and with others as a priority. And then this is also really important for you to discuss as community leaders, would be allowing a fee in lieu or a payment as mitigation to the city for impacts to slopes and some trees. So that rather than trying to replant trees on a site where it may not be advisable, the city would receive those funds and then have the funding to plant more trees where it's consistent with the city's forestry planning. Again, the Natural Resource Mitigation Guide. This would be incorporated by reference. We've started to sort of outline it and put in some of the language that's zoning today that would be important guidance for your staff and for applicants. It's very difficult to write how to mitigate a stream buffer impact as zoning code. You want pictures, you want descriptions, you want if this situation, then do this. That is much better written as guidance than as zoning, which requires a strict sort of black and white approach to review. That's it from me. More than happy to answer questions. Marianne, if there's anything else we can provide, that's what we're here for.
Thanks, JB. I do want to add, because this has already been discussed at the Environmental Commission, and they had a couple of pieces of feedback about the proposal that they reviewed. So there's been some incorporation of their suggestions, but they liked the idea of what they referred to as a stewardship endowment of the fee in lieu program. And also, because of the impact of invasive species in the city, and that has been an ongoing concern for the Environmental Commission, they liked the idea of having mitigation include invasives removal. For example, in city parks and new park developments that we're working on. So they're excited about the idea of a guidance document with meaningful standards because the current standards, I think, are well intended in terms of trying to get at the question of quantity, but really don't address the quality of the types of mitigation that we're requiring and having provided by applicants. So yeah, if the commission has questions for me or for the consultants,
Yes.
fire away.
I'll open it up to the other members first. They may have some questions. Glenn?
So it's good to see that things are reorganized to possibly make things more understandable. That's helpful. Don't want this to come out the wrong way. I do love the birds and the bees and the bunnies and the trees. And I don't want to see Franklin turn into a parking lot. But as Mr. Joel Deedle used to comment that he did some research, and everything Franklin has for environmental protections, you can find somewhere else in the state. But he could not find anybody else in the state that had as many protections as we did. It just seems excessive, even for folks that understand the whole process. There's a few stories here and there every year that you just shake your head and say that looks kind of silly that what we're doing. I'd like to see maybe us to take a closer look at what we could possibly carve out from the ordinance. The protection of the steep slopes, I don't think that's necessarily a steep problem. No pun intended. But the Conservancy District, I think we kind of had to apologize for the standard when they came through. And I know there's been some other projects where we've talked about it. It's not really something that we should protect, I guess, is my personal opinion. So I guess I'd be interested in thoughts what the commission has. And I do appreciate that we're trying to make it more simplified so that people can actually understand what the requirements are. That's good. But if we could carve off a few things, I think, I don't think we would be the better, or we would be the worse for it, so. My personal 2 cents.
Thank you. Anyone else at this point? Okay, I'll jump in. So, yeah, we're at a point where we're almost choking ourselves from projects. I understand the city of Franklin, we have a lot of wetland issues, a lot of areas, and that's been a problem, and we've seen more and more things get obstructed because of it, and I like how Glenn kind of categorized it with what Mr. Deedle said. That's very accurate. I'm all about having the protections there, but not having us be the extra platinum, uranium, gold standard of what's the most difficult place in Wisconsin to build and develop. Well, Franklin comes up to mind. We have to change that, and that's an internal culture change. And until we change that, we're going to have the same issues, choke pointing a lot of things that we want to get accomplished. And we can be as good as the state, as good as the feds, as good as our neighbors, but I personally don't think or would recommend anything more restrictive. And that's how I'm viewing this. And the more we're getting involved in the greater projects, down to, simple Eagle Scout projects and things like that, we're getting whacked on things, and we're really having a problem with some things. And that's now we have a chance to change it and simplify it and make it streamlined, but not more restrictive. That's my 2 cents. Thank you. Anyone else in the panel? Kevin Haley.
I would just share, specific to the steep slopes issue. It seems crazy and ridiculous that we should be protecting those. Where that comes from, what we are protecting, and I believe it's still all in the documents, is the sewer pack designated primary environmental corridors, secondary environmental corridors, and isolated natural areas. They're all three, in essence, the same thing on a different magnitude. Isolated natural area meets the same criteria, it's smaller. Secondary is a larger width and length, and primary. So our ordinances, the way they stand and are being proposed, the way I read it, is that becomes the standard. So we don't need to specifically talk about steep topography. If there's steep topography there and it's one of the things that causes that area to be designated as a primary environmental corridor, because that's what the definitions are. Primary environmental corridors have areas of steep slopes, diversity of plants, water, wetlands, all of there's these criteria that they use. So if we defer to sewer pack, we're in a good place on that, I think. There's no need to specifically talk about steep slopes, because if there are significant steep slopes, they'll be located in a environmental corridor. Basically, where a creek runs through a river, that's where in Franklin you get most of your steep slopes. So I don't think we need to worry about that. We can avoid specific reference, but we do have to include, and I noticed in reading here that we're inconsistent with the language. We need to protect all primary, secondary, and isolated natural areas as defined by sewer pack. Always been that way, it should be. That's a good standard to run with. And sewer pack will come out and delineate those for you or for a developer. It's the right standard to use.
And that's a group that doesn't charge for that?
Southeastern Regional Planning Commission,
Yeah.
the municipalities actually pay them on an annual basis for the overall general planning services that they provide. If an
You have to wait,
individual,
though.
what?
You have to wait quite a while.
Of
for it
course,
to come
that's
out.
the way life
Yeah.
is. If you want it done sooner and sewer pack is available, a private individual can pay them to do it. But again, their rules, it's not about that they're just too busy. It's that in many cases, they can only do certain delineations in springtime. They can't go in winter and delineate spring
Right.
ephemeral. So it's the standard. There are also ways that consultants can identify those looking at the criteria, but ultimately the designation falls to sewer pack. So you could make a compelling argument that this area should be, for example, a secondary environmental corridor.
Sure.
And provide that to sewer pack, and then they would potentially add that to their list. The city uses their lists.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Haley.
Mhm.
Any other comments at this point from up here at the commission? Mr. City Engineer.
Yeah, so love the fact the Environmental Commission is very dedicated and appreciate the work that they do. I know there's been several instances where, again, people that understand the process and trying to get a project through, frustrated that, oh, they only meet once a month kind of thing, and, you know, trying to meet those deadlines and everything. So I think when we talked earlier today, there was, you can correct me if I'm wrong in the understanding, but possibly in the future, we won't have to have as many projects go to the Environmental Commission. We could possibly, you know, review some things, if you will, on staff level that are cut and dry, and review things and we know what it is, and we know how to, if you will, mitigate. We can require mitigation, if you will, on staff level. And again, it all gets approved by Common Council, but one, to save them some time, but two, the developers are really in a hurry sometimes, and you know, it's a process you got to go through, and it just sometimes can delay it, you know, up to a month. So.
Commissioner Hogan?
I just want to say that this guidebook that she brought up, I think this is a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we should go forward with that. I like that idea very, very much.
Okay. Commissioner Haley?
Thank you. We need to talk about mitigation banks. We're talking about mitigation. The issue is what needs to be mitigated, and then where and how. The tendency recently, in recent years, is for mitigation banking to occur. And most of these are up in northern Wisconsin. They're not here in the watershed or the sub-watershed, as parts of our UDO require. But it allows developers the opportunity to, okay, I'm going to have an impact, but many times they're the ones that have the money but not the time to go in and do a mitigation and spend the 5 years making it all work. So you can literally write a check to one of the cranberry growers in northern Wisconsin that are constantly doing wetland creation, and they have a contract with the DNR, and a developer can just write a check and buy 0.73 acres of mitigation. That's going on. We've allowed it to happen here in Franklin, even though it stands against our ordinances the way I understand it. My understanding is we require mitigation in town and in many cases in sub-watershed, which is almost impossible to accomplish, which basically implies on the same property. So I'm not advocating that we do that, but we need to come to grips with it, because there'll be many developers, and I've sat in this spot and listened to them say, I don't have 5 years to do wetland mitigation. Who do I write a check to? So we need to accommodate that. And unfortunately, there's two solutions. One, either mitigation happens out of watershed, out of Franklin, someplace else in the state, or we have to create those mitigation banks. Now, I believe that there's a lot of people that are interested in doing that. My understanding is Milwaukee County is going to be establishing some on some of their properties. I've heard rumors of some other communities doing it, but it's a way, and we're sort of talking about it, but we're dancing around that subject. So if we got a developer who comes in and he's got lots of impacts, we can either, now we're proposing is take a check from them, a payment in lieu of, or we can have created different types of banks that then they can buy credits in that they just move over to. But we can't just shift and do this. And it's the problem why we're not getting successful mitigation and it's not happening here in Franklin is because your average homeowner has no problem fixing up a little corner of something. But developers that are having significant impacts on the magnitude of acres of impacts don't want anything to do with that. And they don't want the lifetime commitment of maintaining and preserving that. So they like to write a check. But again, allowing them to write that check allows it to go out of Franklin. So we have to find some way of addressing that. And if we just require it right now or offer it as an option, which is probably what I'd recommend, is in the ordinances that mitigation credits can be purchased, but they need to be in Franklin. And then that'll provide somebody a financial incentive to actually create these banks. It's a really great solution. You've got a lot of farmlands that can't be developed, can't be farmed in many cases, but could be fixed up and turned into ongoing mitigation projects that then make their money go right to the check. We can talk about it in more details, but it's one of the issues that we're going to have to come to grips with because we don't want, the DNR requires mitigation at the state level. What we're talking about doing is continuing to require that not only at the state level, but that it happens here. So it can also get us in a situation where you've got a developer saying, hey, I can purchase credits up north. Why do I have to do it here? So we need to iron through that, and I don't know that it's been dealt with, and maybe JB's got some insights on that, but
Okay,
enough on that one.
thank you, Mr. Haley. Marion?
Actually, JB has her hand up, so I just wanted to call your attention to that.
Oh, I didn't, oh, look at the little hand thing.
Little hand.
Look at that. JB?
Yeah. Thank you. I would like to clarify a couple things on wetland. How do I get this hand to go away? There it goes. On wetlands. First of all, it's recognized in the draft of the ordinance, in the details. And I think you would find that this draft basically says you've got to get your DNR permit, and Franklin won't get involved in that. The idea here for mitigation is to have applicants do something, but not necessarily to try to create new wetlands or to bank wetlands within Franklin. Creating new wetland mitigation banks in southeast Wisconsin is not on the immediate horizon, unfortunately. It would be great to see that happen. And so I just want to go over what's in the draft. That first of all, the city would, and this would be new, exempt any artificial wetlands, clearly. So that's not even a question. The next would be to exempt what are now defined as degraded wetlands. Okay, so I think that will take care of a lot of the situations that have been challenging, where it has felt like Franklin might be requiring something other places are not. So if we've got a wetland delineation and it says it's a degraded wetland, you don't have to do anything about it unless it's within a sewer pack, primary, secondary, unless it's within one of those defined sewer pack areas, in which case it's really an avoid or do other, you're going to be avoiding those to a large extent anyway. And then there is some, if you're going to have impacts, you need to do some mitigation, but it doesn't have to be wetland creation, wetland credits, or wetland banking. The idea is to give lots of options that are straightforward, environmentally beneficial, and low cost, such as doing some green stormwater management. You got to do that to get your MMSD permit anyway. Using deep-rooted vegetation instead of turf grass. Planting some supplemental trees, or any combination of that. And this is where we could also use that mitigation guide to say, here are some other beneficial actions you can take rather than trying to recreate a wetland. So I just want to point that out, that I think in the details, this is 26 pages, so I know no normal person wants to read all of that, but in there, we've really proposed some much more flexible option for impacts to, especially to degraded wetlands, to wetland buffers, again, which need to be fenced, and to some of the woodland areas. I would concur wholeheartedly that getting rid of steep slopes would do nobody any harm and cut down about a page of this document. But I just wanted to point that out on wetlands.
Thank you. Any other further comments on this at this point? Mr. Haley?
I would just respond that we keep in mind, I love where you're going, and these are all great ideas, and we need alternatives, but the goal is to preserve and protect as many of these as possible, to not allow them to be decimated by the act of development, and then you try to put them back in place. So there's a certain amount of deterrence that we want to have in this, and it shouldn't be difficult, and you should have options to do it, but the whole idea of natural resource protections is to protect natural resources, not to go and bulldoze them and then try to create them here and there. We all know that's a very difficult task and oftentimes fails.
Thank you, Mr. Haley. Mr. Morrow?
So could you expand a little bit more on the conversation about the Supreme Court decision on wetlands and what that means here in Wisconsin, and when do we expect to hear what that means, and how might that trickle down to our ordinance? If someone's not familiar, as I understand, the Supreme Court basically said that unless a wetland is connected to a body of water, that it doesn't count, if you will. So it's got a lot of states scratching their heads. So at least that's my paraphrase of what they said.
Marion, you want to take a stab at it?
Sure. So the case you're referring to, I believe, is the Sackett decision that was handed down recently. And my understanding of the conclusion that was drawn there is that our obligation to ensure that the Army Corps has a determination about whether or not something is a federal water has not changed. What has changed is the test that the Army Corps uses to determine whether or not something is a federal water. So in reality, it will not really affect the administrative process that we require, in the sense that we need people to confirm whether or not something is a federal water as they're pursuing their permitting process. Is that kind of aligning with what you think, JB?
Yes. And I think the more important issue for Franklin is adopting the state's definition of degraded wetland, which gives you more opportunity to not, to the Commissioner Haley's point, no, this is not encouraging the disruption of anything of hydrologic benefit. But we all know that there are degraded wetlands that are isolated, that are anthropogenic. I think the state has done a great job of defining those. And I think that will stand independently of whatever happens to delineation practice under the Sackett decision, which lots of expensive attorneys still can't figure out what it means.
Thank you. Any further comment at this time on this item? Thank you. Thank you very much. Move forward then.
Okay, 1 second. Self-organized. So are we moving on from this agenda item, or?
No, we'll just move forward from this. I mean, we can still stay on this agenda item until whatever else you got, you're going to keep.
I mean, that concludes the presentation. If there's additional information that the commission would like to provide, or comments that you have on this section, now's the time, or you're certainly welcome to forward them to staff, and I will convey them to the consultants. At this point, we have a few more pieces of the UDO to work through before we arrive at a final draft. And the scheduling of that, we'll have to get back to you about when the next meeting is. But this was the last substantive chapter that needed to be drafted before the conclusion of the drafting process. So, yeah, that's it for today.
Thank you. Very good job. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very good.
And I have to apologize because my large packet had disappeared. So if this was the last item before we adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
So we've got a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Oh, I had some comments.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Haley. You have the floor.
I'm sorry, I thought we were going to actually talk about this.
Oh, I thought we
We
did.
talked a little bit about it.
Okay, let's go more then.
In general format, this one, shoreline wetland zoning ordinances, I think it's really well done. The problem that I have with it is it appears to have been borrowed from something else, and you get through the document and you read, and it keeps talking about the department and all these other entities. You get to the final last page and there's definitions that says what department means. So we should either move the definitions to the front of the sections, or if there's a pressing region, to move them to the back. Then early in the narrative, for example, the first time that they use the word department, meaning Department of Natural Resources, it should say Department of Natural Resources, hereafter department. It's strictly a semantic thing, but in reading it, I'm reading through here, I'm going like, well, wait, what department? Is this zoning department? Is this building inspection?
Right.
So that should be a real easy cleanup. And on all of the things, all of the sections, good quality definitions, and I personally think they belong right up front, unless there's some compelling reason, because before I get into 9 pages, I'm going to look at the definition, the glossary, and see what those things are and what's actually in here. Okay? I like that one. The first one here, the reorganized, it's difficult to read. And I know it's because you're moving things around and shifting. It's a great improvement. But I have a whole bunch of small issues, some of them semantic and,
It's tough to hear you, Kevin.
I'm sorry. I guess I'd be better off sharing these directly with staff. We don't need to go through them all now, but the document as it stands, and I'm referring to the reorganized and amended natural resource protection plans. It needs help. It doesn't read well, it doesn't read easily, and that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Right.
So, and the description I got about moving and shifting all things around, that's great. Let's do that though. Because as I read this, and I try to read it with, I'm a bit more technical than other people, and I try to read it with the commoner's eyes, there's some things that just get very confusing. I understand what they mean. But there's also some technical things that are just plain wrong. Okay?
Did you,
And I'd love to know why we hate ash trees, but we won't go there.
so basically, Commissioner Haley, do you want to share that with Marion?
It
And
would
then,
probably be best if I sat down with her and went through that.
if you're okay with that?
Yeah.
You're okay with that, Marion?
And we can mark up, there's an online version that we can mark up together if that's necessary, so.
Yes. I mean, you're not going to understand my notes, and I don't want to have to spend 8 hours trying to transcribe it all for you, but there's some very simple things
Excellent.
that I think we can clarify.
Any other comments from anyone before we go for adjournment? No. Nice try, Dana. Okay.
I'm
Oh,
sorry.
Mr. Haley, go ahead.
We're wrapping this all up. Can I get a feel for the process moving forward? We heard people saying, when does the public get a whack at it? We've been working at this for 2 years, and we're making, I understand, but sort of generally, what's the next steps? Where do we go, and at what intervals do we envision going public with this? Are we just going to keep doing it in chunks like this? Somebody pulls together the whole big fat thing, and then we got to read it? I'm reading all this stuff. I don't know about everybody else, but at some point, it needs to be a final document. So I'm just wondering how that happens. And every time somebody talks to me about the natural resources, it's, well, when do we get to weigh in on? What's happening? What are you guys doing with all that? So I think we owe it to reach out to the public, maybe at some point a month from now when this is more coalesced. I don't know.
Well,
I'm asking.
Okay.
What's the
so
plan?
I'm trying to attempt to answer.
All right, I'll shut up.
Okay, sure. So I guess, and this is what I would like to talk to staff about, what their vision is and how this would move along. I have an idea that when it gets basically probably into the final draft, when it's a final draft, then we would take input on reaction to the draft. And after reaction to the draft is done, then we would go back and, staff would look at that reaction and move forward from that. But I don't see, unless staff thinks that there should be some other thing else. I mean, I'm open. I just want community feedback, but it's like Commissioner Haley said, what would the timing be? That's just my 2 cents. What do you think, Madam Director?
Sure. I would love to actually piecemeal it out. It is a lot easier for the public to digest it in that manner. I also have a very unique situation that I came in on the tail end, and I have found a couple of things that I would love to see change that maybe we just was not part of the discussion before, but just to fine tune it a little bit more. So there are going to be some more tweaks, but I really would love to have the public's help in that manner too.
So what would your plan be as far as when you say piecemeal? I mean, like put a certain part on one of our planning meeting nights and have them review it, put it on our website, and then they can take a look at it and come back and comment. I mean,
I'm a big fan of hands-on, like having an open house and having some open dialogue, because people in general just have a lot of questions.
Sure.
And it's easy to misunderstand maybe the intent of what they're reading, because our staff maybe have a different skill set than, say, the reader. So I know we've run into other issues for other communities I've worked with where, like, builders, wouldn't agree with certain things because how it impacts their business. I don't want to create situations like that either. There just needs to be a better dialogue. So,
One other question, in concept, are we thinking that the next level that goes public, is that going to be a red line strikeout in which we try to track what we had and how we got there? Or are we just going to show a nice clean, forget what was there, this is what we're proposing now?
if I remember correctly, and maybe Ruben, who's on the phone on Zoom right now, can clear up, but we did take all the comments from Plan Commission meetings and Common Council and started inserting it into the draft as of right now.
Yep, and yep, I can chime in here too. Ruben Shell, I'm with Halcyon Levine Consultants on the project here. So we do have both a red line version that shows existing changes from the existing UDO and revisions that we've made based on the first round of review with Plan Commission to date, and clean versions that show how the draft might read today. So I think we can make both of those versions available for Plan Commission as we move forward in future review dates.
If I may, it's really a process thing. How these are very difficult things to explain to the public.
Mhm.
So I think, I mean, maybe I'm answering my own question. Maybe some of us want to see it in red line strikeout, but ultimately I think we should be coming forward and saying, we've revisited it. This is what we're proposing. Tell us what you think.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, to go and show red line, given how many places where we're really shifting from one area to the next, to try to make it, flow a little bit easier, I think it would be much more helpful just to show it in the, that final draft form to allow people to have a reaction to it. And I'm hoping our new format, it's easier to see those connections than where right now everything is just so piecemealed. I want people to feel the total impact.
I concur. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to get clear on how we're moving
Sure.
forward. Thank you.
That's fine. Any other comments on this? So, all right, so Kevin and Mr. Commissioner Haley will work with Marion on some changes and suggestions he has in his area. And then we're going to keep moving forward with the rewrite. And then we'll work with staff on when we think we could probably put out something and have some community feedback. Open house would be great. Something here, nice once the air's back working or it gets cooler out. And then we can, have that opportunity to talk and discuss it in here. And
I don't think you'd have it here. I think you'd have to go to like the high school or the middle school or something. You will have a lot of people come. This would not accommodate that, I don't think. That's just my
Okay.
input.
I like
because
field
when
trips
we
to
had-
middle school.
Pardon?
I said, I like field trips. Let's go to middle school. It's beautiful.
All I'm saying is I've been to meetings where they've had it and it's been full.
I also have found it beneficial actually to hook up with other events that are very popular in the community. You're already having people in there. They might not intentionally come to a public meeting like this, but if we just happen to be there, we might strike up a better conversation with people that normally don't engage in this kind of public involvement.
Sounds good. Okay, well, it's a fluid work in progress about getting it out there, but definitely we're going to have community feedback for sure. 100%, yes. Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
First and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Great job, Marion.